Hello everyone, welcome to another Quad Education Test Prep Fundamentals video. My name is Tom, and today we're starting off a series of videos where I'm going to talk about the various question types and procedures associated with ACT English and SAT writing question types. This is a really essential skill for being effective and quick with both of those sections, so let's take a look. Okay, so really important basic premise for SAT writing and ACT English. First of all, they're both basically the same thing. There's very little difference between the two tests in that regard. And second, there's very little variety in the kinds of questions that you'll see on both tests. So the way that you want to approach, and this is the big key to approaching both of these sections, is to identify what kind of question it is as specifically as possible before you start doing the question. So broadly speaking, there are two kinds of questions that you'll see on the test: those that have prompts and those that do not. So a question that has a prompt will just have legitimately a question there that you have to read and then answer. But a promptless question will just have answers, and you'll have to know the grammatical issue in order to answer that question. So for this first part today, we're going to talk about what the promptless questions are. In future video, I'll talk about what the prompted questions are, then I'll talk about the procedures associated with solving each of those, and then maybe we'll do a little bit more in depth in identifying question types later on. But for now, today, we're just going to identify all the important promptless questions you'll see on the ACT English and SAT writing. So especially on ACT, the one that you'll see the most frequently is structure and punctuation. And this one is pretty self-explanatory. So this is to say questions where they're testing punctuation or structure. So usually the words will all be the same, but the punctuation marks around those words will be different. And other times when it's less obvious, what they'll do is they'll put some words into a clause that render the clause independent or dependent, and you'll have to decide whether the punctuation associated with that option breaks or completes the punctuation rules that we've talked about in other videos. So structure and punctuation, you're going to see something that has a comma versus a dash or versus a semicolon, something like that. And so the great thing about structure and punctuation is that it's very technical, and there's lots of really specific rules you can apply. And the next question type we're going to look at is completely the opposite. So structure and punctuation, probably the thing you see the most. And then the second most frequent you'll see is word choice. So word choice is basically vocabulary. So that's to say which word here is the correct word. This is different from other question types in that something like transition, which I guess you could say is a word choice question, there's actually specifically a reason why you're picking transition. With word choice, it's more like, what's the difference between illustrate and illuminate? Like, what's the difference between those two words? Well, it's just vocab. Do you know what the word means or don't you? Next, we have transition, which is your however versus for example, things like that. In previous videos, we've talked about how transitions are always a positive, so that's a structural decision. With transitions, is actually just, is it however, or is it something like indeed? So it's the decision between transition words. So verb tense, pretty interesting. Verb tense is to do with conjugating verbs, and I include parallelism and subject-verb agreement right after verb tense because I like to think of parallelism and subject-verb agreement as subtypes of verb tense. And you could argue that correctly that parallelism has non-verb parallel issues, but I like to group these together in this way to show that if you're seeing this as verb tense, it may also be parallel verb use or subject-verb agreement to do with verb tense. And then verb tense not being parallelism or subject-verb agreement is going to be something more toward, like, is it past tense or present tense based off of the context of the paragraph that the verb appears in. Next, we have parallelism, which is to say making things match. And I believe we'll have a parallelism video coming out if there isn't already one out. Next, we have subject-verb agreement, which we've definitely covered in the past. Really good question type with really fun little shortcut associated with that question type. Next, very closely associated with subject-verb agreement is the pronoun question type. So with subject-verb agreement, we're matching the verb to the plurality of the subject. So this is an is versus are consideration. When you say he is versus they are, you wouldn't say he are versus they is. And then pronoun is pretty similar. It's to say one car would be it, and then multiple cars would be they. You would say them if it was an object and they if it was a subject, things like that. Next, we have redundancy, and redundancy just means repetition unnecessarily in context of an English passage. In the real world, redundancy is when two things serve the same purpose, and sometimes in the real world, redundancy is good, but on the test, redundancy is never what we want. And then finally, we have misplaced modifier. I'm not going to go too much into detail about what this is right now because we have a video about this, but this is at the end here because there's not very many of them, maybe one or two per test. And there are a couple of other miscellaneous types that sort of you could call the number 10 right here, but what we've done here is included the 9 most frequent kinds of questions that you'll see on the test with a quick little definition of them. View our individual videos for each of these for like a better explanation of punctuation, so you can get a really good idea of them. Because the way that we're going to do questions, like I mentioned, on the writing and the English test is look at a question and decide what kind of question it is before we solve it. And so for practice today, what we're going to do is go ahead and work on identifying question types. So as you can see, I've copy-pasted the question types, the Promptless question types over to the left hand there for a quick reference. What you'll do now is go ahead and look at the questions I've provided here and identify what kinds of questions they are. So obviously number 15 there has a prompt, so we're not going to do that one today. That's for next time. But we have at least those first 5, which I've listed from an ACT, and then that question 16 there from the SAT. Go ahead and see what you can do with identifying those question types. All right, let's take a look and see what we can see. So number 1 here pretty clearly is going to be structure and punctuation. We'll just call that S and P. Next here, kind of an interesting one. I thanked her, but regarded it as I would have the bones of a prehistoric animal, yet regarding, so regarded, but regarding. So we could say we have this sort of regarding versus regarded. This could be called verb tense. And as you can see, we're not going to be answering the questions here today. We're just trying to identify a relevant type so that we can solve this more efficiently. And we can say also, if it's verb tense, is our subtype parallelism or subject verb going to apply? And I would say there's sort of a little bit of parallelism here as well we could use to solve this more efficiently. Next, we have sort of a mystery here for number 3. And we basically, if you're not quite sure immediately what it is, go ahead and give the sentence a read and see what it looks like. And also another pro tip for ACT and SAT, the word being is almost never correct. If you see the word being in an answer, it's probably not that one. So looking at the sentence, being used to the computer keyboard, tapping keys, the letters appearing on screen as if by magic. So what you may notice here is we have a problem. And the problem is that we have a fragment because nothing is happening. And because it's a fragment, that illustrates to us the question type, which is that this is a structure and punctuation question because we cannot have fragments. And indeed, whenever we're not really sure what kind of question we have, it's probably a structure and punctuation question. Next, for number 4, it's a little bit more straightforward. This is just going to be a transition question. That's just what these look like. We have to setting between even so, for example, in contrast and still. Next, for number 5, this is actually going to be redundancy because you can see each of the keys was raised on a metal slit, which, if jabbed forcibly enough, would snap up and imprint the paper with the print of the corresponding letter. And we already know print. And depending on the key that was pressed, depending on the key that was raised, this is the same thing. Down here with the SAT question, I'm going to say, remember, we don't want to do that because we're not doing prompted questions today. We're only doing promptless. And then here at 16, you read the sentence again because we're not sure. We have both and both of whom. The lion dance requires the strength, grace, and coordination of 2 dancers, both of whom are almost completely hidden by the elaborate bamboo and papier-mâché lion costume that they maneuver. So once again, we have both of whom, it renders dependent, but of which both are sort of the same thing. But certainly with C and D, what we've done here is created independent clauses. So based on the fact that we're changing the nature of the clause here, this is also structure and punctuation, which definitely points to the idea that a lot, and probably more than you expect, of the questions on both of these tests are structure and punctuation based. Okay, that's it for this video. So when you're looking to identify a question type, make sure you're just checking around the context of where the question appears, as well as looking at the format of the answers. Today we just did promptless questions, prompted questions coming next. If you found this material useful, we hope that you will like and share the video and subscribe to Quiet Education. If you have any kind of tutor need, please reach out to us. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.